Hi, my name is Monica Hegde, and I'm a PhD student at the INCC under the supervision of Lauriane Cabrera and Thierry Nazy. And today I'll be presenting some results, most of my results, from my PhD project that's looking at spectro-temporal processing of speech during phonological development. And so the main goal of this project was to determine the acoustic information that infants use to process sounds in their native language. And basically what we know is that the maturation of the auditory cortex continues to develop until adolescence, even until late adolescence. As you can see in the image, those are the axons migrating. But given the long development of the young infant's brain, given the fact that the infant's brain is still fairly immature, but that they're able to process complex acoustic information like speech in an adult-like manner, we're interested in knowing how exactly they are able to do this. And on a linguistic level, we know that infants by the age of 6 months begin to become attuned to their native language vowels, and infants by the age of 10 months become attuned to their native language consonants and show an adult-like processing of language. And on a similar note, we also know that 6-month-old infants rely primarily on vowel information when segmenting words, when picking out words from a continuous speech stream. Whereas between 8 to 10 months of age, there's a shift towards relying on more consonant-related information for speech segmentation. And so given this attunement to phonetic information during the first year of life, we want to know any kind of interplay that there might be with acoustic cues on this same timeline. And so my PhD project focuses on investigating the use of acoustic cues at different stages of language processing. So first, I did an electrophysiological study using EEG, studying the role of acoustic cues in phonetic processing of consonant sounds, which I presented last year. So I'll be skipping over that for the sake of time. But if you have any questions afterwards, feel free to ask. Second, used an observer-based behavioral study to look at how infants use acoustic cues to categorize sounds based on their phonetic properties. And finally, a study on word segmentation to better understand how infants use acoustic cues and which acoustic cues they weight the most when segmenting words from continuous speech. And so to study these cues across the different levels of phonetic processing, we used what's called a psychoacoustic approach, which is rooted in cochlear processing. And so in order to study the development of acoustic processing, we use this approach, which allows us to decompose the speech signal into a way that's biologically plausible. And so our cochlea has around 3,500 cilia in the basilar membrane, and each of these hair cells responds to a specific range of frequencies. And so here we have an image of an unrolled cochlea, and you can see from the base to the apex. So here, we are able to respond to frequencies as high as 20 kilohertz and as low as 20 hertz in frequency. And so with our psychoacoustic model, we can conceptualize these inner hair cells in terms of a series of narrow band filters. And in the specific model we use, we have 32 filters which decompose sound in a way that mimics cochlear processing. And so this decomposition into 32 bands is what we refer to as spectral decomposition. And then once the information that we've is decomposed into our 32 spectral bands, we can take each of these 32 bands and decompose it even further into its temporal components. And for our temporal components, we can extract the FM, So this is the blue information here, and that corresponds to the fastest frequency modulations in the signal, and the AM, which corresponds to the overall envelope fluctuations of the signal. And the AM can be further decomposed into its faster and its slower components. The fast AM corresponds to these contours that you see in red, and the slow AM would correspond to a more filtered, flattened version of this envelope. And so our general question is whether listeners learn to rely more on certain acoustic cues relevant to their native language phonology. And so earlier I talked about spectral and temporal degradation. And so for my 3 studies, the first 2 studies will look at temporal degradation, and the third study will look at spectral degradation. And so I'll present the different conditions that we have in our studies, and then I'll go through the studies one by one. So our first condition is the intact condition, and here essentially we break up our speech signal into the 32 bands spectrally, and then temporally decompose them here, and then sum them back up to create the vocoded signal. And this corresponds to something like a regular voice, like what I'm saying now. And our second condition is the fast condition. So here we want to understand the importance of the FM. And so we'll be replacing, we'll be presenting stimuli with the FM replaced with a pure tone carrier in each of the 32 bands in order to determine whether we elicit a similar or a different response to the intact signal. And so our third condition is the slow condition, where in addition to degrading the FM, we also degrade our amplitude modulations such that only the slowest amplitude modulations are present. And by doing this, we can see whether the fast amplitude modulations play a role in the processing and perception of our stimuli. And so, and additionally, we are also looking at two spectral conditions, one with 16 AM vocoder and one with an 8-band vocoder. And so essentially here, we're replacing the FM with a pure tone carrier, but only in either 8 or 16 bands. And so these are referred to as our spectral conditions, and this will be important for the third study I present. And so my first study, which I'll gloss over, it looks at the neural processing of speech. So we were interested in how the infant's auditory system processes speech on a neural level, specifically looking at the effect of age, testing 6-month-olds, 10-month-olds, and adults, and looking at the effect of temporal degradation for 2 native and 1 non-native consonant. And just to give you a summary, what we find is that 10-month-old behavioral patterns are more similar to adult patterns than to 6-month-old patterns, suggesting that neural speech auditory mechanisms do evolve on a similar timeline as consonant attunement during the first year of life. And so, our previous study focused on these non-native consonant contrasts, and as well as in addition to native contrasts. And now, in order to examine vowels and their contrasts in greater detail, and also to understand how infants and adults process this information, we're able to use an observer-based method where we can directly compare adults and infants' behavior in a way that wasn't possible with only EEG. And so this would allow us to provide a more comprehensive metric to study the comparison of adult and infant processing for both consonants and vowels that occur natively in French. Okay, and so for this study, we used 16 French vowel consonant VC words, presented in one of 4 discrimination conditions. So for consonant place, consonant voicing, vowel height, and vowel place. For each of our age groups, for 6-month-olds, 10-month-olds, and adults. And here we use an observer-based method for all participants, adults and infants. So the method is a yes-no type task that's used to assess sensitivity to phonemic change. And so infants are seated on their caregiver's lap, and they're facing a window, a tinted window, a one-way window. And an assistant is in the booth with the infant to keep the infants calm and entertained. And so both the assistant and the parent wear headphones so they don't hear the sounds being presented. And outside the booth, the observer, which is me, is controlling the experiment. And so once the infant's ear tips are inserted, the sounds of the background category will start to be played repeatedly. So if, for example, the background category was unvoiced, they would hear some combination of tu, po, chu, pu, po, etc. And when the observer observes that the infant is quite calm, the observer will launch a trial with the button press. And 2 types of trial can occur. So either a change of a stimulus category, a change trial, or a no change trial. In the no change trial, one sound from the background category will play. In the change trial, one sound from the target category will play. So if, for example, the background category was voiceless, then voiced consonant, one of these voiced consonants would play. And at that point, the observer has 4 seconds to decide, just solely based on the infant's behavior, whether or not the baby detected a change. So that could be if the baby frowned its eyes, turned its head, many things. And the observer, if the baby detects a change, and if the observer detects that the baby detected the change, the observer will press the button and say, I think the baby detected a change. And then the TV, if the baby detected the change, the TV will turn on with a child-friendly cartoon. We have Wee Wee for 4 seconds to reinforce the behavior that the baby spontaneously makes. And then that is then used as an index of change detection for the experiment. And so once, so like with this method, we're able to measure the sensitivity of acoustic cues that'll be based on the number of listeners that successfully complete the various sessions. So we have, in our first session, we have the fast condition, so with the full envelope, and the infants will have to achieve an 80% rate of correct hit trials and less than 20% or less of false alarm trials, which corresponds to a D prime of 1. And this is on the last 5 consecutive change and no change trials. And what we find is that on a perceptual level, 6-month-olds and 10-month-olds show no overall differences with regard to consonant or vowel discrimination. However, both 6-month-olds and adults are significantly show significantly different survival curve responses from adults, showing that for the difference between 6-month-olds and adults is mostly driven by differences in vowel responses, whereas the differences between 10-month-olds and adults is driven by both vowel and consonant responses. And so on a perceptual level, we find that degradation of FM affects infants more than it does for adults. And so now that we've seen the role of acoustic information on a phonetic level, we want to look at word segmentation, which we know has been observed as early as 6 months of age, and even earlier. And so we want to know what information babies use to detect word form in sentences on an acoustic level. And so we used the head-turn preferential procedure to record infant looking time in a passage word task. And so we tested 4 groups of infants. All infants heard 1 minute of passages containing 1 target word from one of 4 lists that you can see here during the familiarization phase of the test. And infants would hear repetition. During the test phase, infants would hear repetitions of isolated control words, which are linguistically distant from target words. And so we had 2 groups of 6-month-olds and 2 groups of 10-month-olds in 2 vocoder conditions of spectrally degraded conditions. So 16-band vocoder condition and 8-band vocoder condition. And I have some sounds that you can hear. So that's this is a 16-band condition. And this is a passage where f is repeated multiple times. And this is the same thing in the 8-band condition. And what we find is that infants are unable to segment, 6-month-old infants are unable to segment vocoded speech at either 8 or 16, with either 8 or 16-band vocoders. However, at 10 months, infants are able to segment speech with a 16-band vocoder, showing novelty preference. And at 10 months, they're still unable to segment words with 8-band vocoders. And so this suggests that at a lexical level, FM and fine spectral cues are necessary for word form segmentation at 6 months of age, but not as much at 10 months of age. And so to summarize, in our first study, we found that the neural speech auditory mechanisms evolve on a similar timeline as consonant perceptual attunement. On a perceptual level, the degradation of FM affects infants more so than adults. And at a lexical level, FM and fine spectral cues are necessary for word form segmentation more so at 6 months than at 10 months of age. Thank you.